This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and lots of different guests. But today you've got me on my own because I thought I would talk about something that's incredibly important to me, but also increasingly important, I think, in the world that we live in, which is how you can have a really beautiful, festive, joyful, glorious Christmas, but without it creating a sort of problem for the environment, really, for the world. And so not being a killjoy at all, because that's the last thing I want, because I really, really love Christmas. And I love all the scents and the candles and the twinkle and the colour. It's just completely right up my street. The presents, the family, for me, it's a really precious time. Also the kind of hibernation away with the family. So yeah, I love Christmas and I really look forward to it. But I just am incredibly aware that we need to be sustainable. And I remember reading something that the amount of wrapping, it was actually on the very, very good website, the Soil Association website, that had some stuff about sustainable Christmas. And every year in the UK alone, we throw away enough wrapping paper to circle the globe 9 times. And I know that's a bit of a soundbite, but it's just kind of worth thinking about all these things and how we can approach the next 2 weeks with just a little niggling kind of thought in our head is, how can we make this really beautiful, really colourful, really joyful, but also sustainable? So I've put some time into thinking about that. And I actually found myself writing an article for a new platform that I'm writing for called Scribehound Gardening. And it's really nice for me to do that because I used to write for The Telegraph every week, and I've actually stopped doing nearly so much writing. And the lovely thing about writing is it makes you take a step out of your day-to-day life and just think about things a bit more deeply, or one particular thing that you're writing about. And for me, Sustainable Christmas was what I wrote about. And it got me thinking that I wanted to do this podcast because I wanted to do it in even more detail, I guess. So I'm going to just go through the different areas that as we head towards Christmas, I've been thinking, what am I going to be doing here? What am I going to be doing there? And I'm just going to take you through kind of, should you do this or that, as a kind of, a mind map of going through Christmas in a sustainable way. And I want to just completely shout out, rather modern, maybe horrible new phrase, my friend and flower colleague, Shane Connolly, because he's really leading the way in sustainable floristry with lots of others. Flowers from the Farm are brilliant at it, the Instagram, which covers lots of different florists. But Shane has just done lots of research about how he can fill amazing spaces in public galleries and museums, the V&A, the Royal Academy, etc., but do it in a sustainable way. So he's put a lot of thought into it. And I turned to him for advice on several of these things. So I really want to applaud Shane for what he's doing and making us think about it in a jolly, beautiful, colourful way so that it doesn't need to be all brown paper. So I guess number one is the wreath. So on your door, well, I've been making a wreath for the doors here, different ones, for many years now. Well, many, many years. I mean, like 40 years, I suppose. And, I used to teach wreath making courses for about 20 years. I loved doing it. And so I am kind of responsible for a lot of wreaths that have been out and about in the world. over the last 20 or 30 years. But I would say wreaths are wonderful because as you walk towards a house or a flat door, it's like, welcome, hello. It's not any single day of the year. It's building up to Christmas and we're celebrating that and it's jolly. So I think a door wreath is a lovely thing. So how do you make them as sustainable as possible? So I guess number one is starting with the base. So if you can possibly make your own base from stuff in your garden, if you have a garden, so much the better. And so it's whippy, pliable things. So have you got dogwood in your garden? Or perhaps, well, so that's cornice. I find quite often silver birch is really quite pliable by December. There are actually lots of things. Wisteria that you can prune now. Quite a few different clematises that have put out a lot of growth and you can take the top shoots off that and that's quite pliable. It's got to be pliable but also relatively strong once it's twisted and woven around in a circle into each other. So that's the first thing to think about. And why not use the copper wire base, which is a sort of traditional thing to do? Absolutely you can, but just with a promise to yourself that you'll strip it down and you'll then put it in the attic with the Christmas decorations or wherever you put them, and you'll use it again the following year. The point about the wooden base is that I remember Shane teaching here in the spring and him saying, whenever he's making arrangement, he's thinking, can that all go on the compost heap in 5 or 6 days' time? Well, hopefully with a Christmas wreath in 3 or 4 weeks' time. And it will all just rot away to nothing. And that's a really good, biodegradable. You'll come across things like biodegradable cellophane, so-called biodegradable, glitter. And these are things that do break down quicker, but I can tell you from doing a trial of biodegradable glitter here, we were still turning it in the compost heap 6 months later. So doesn't quite do it, does it? So it's things that return to organic matter relatively quickly. So I think a wooden base is fabulous if possible. So then the other thing you could do is you could decide you're not going to go in a circle like a classic wreath base. And I've done experiments with, I know this sounds utterly bizarre, but literally using a huge potato. Now, that does sound crazy, but a big potato, of course, has got moisture in it. And you're then going to be putting in some evergreen branches like rosemary and perhaps some evergreen fir or some lichen branches or pine cones or whatever. And they need a little bit of moisture. And of course, with a potato, they've got a little bit of moisture. So I did an experiment with this and it worked actually really, really well. And it lasted really, really well. It looked good for at least 3 weeks. So think about a whopping great baking potato as your base. But of course, that's going to come away from the door a little bit. But so it forms more of almost like a sphere rather than a circle. But just, have a go, experiment. So the next thing after the base is what you then cover it with. And the traditional thing, of course, with your wire base is that you then cover it with moss. So first of all, that's absolutely fine. But maybe go for a walk or go to your lawn or the paths or a shady bit of your garden and harvest your own moss. And that's sort of more sustainable, more local, all that kind of stuff, all that important stuff. And so if possible, do that. And you can. Arthur Parkinson, who I work with a lot, always recommends just getting quite a tough toothed rake and just going out to the lawn and raking the moss out of the lawn. So that would be the other thing. But you don't have to use moss. Remember that. If you're going to actually use quite long-lived things like rosemary, etc., you don't have to use moss. But anyway, in the next classic layer, so you've got your base, you've then got your padding, and that's normally moss. How do you attach it onto the base? Well, this is important, and it's not with real wire, which of course won't biodegrade and can't just go on the compost heap. So really use twine. So some perhaps tarred string that will be strong enough and robust enough on the door if it gets wet not to rot quickly, but it will just rot away to nothing and biodegrade properly. And just use it in exactly the same way as you would have used real wire, but use twine. So you've got your base, you've got your moss cover, you've attached it, and then I tend to add some kind of twiggy material. So we've just had the most terrible storm over the last few days, and all the roads and paths are covered in lichen branches and twigs. Perfect. Go and get some of those and put them somewhere in the corner until you're ready to use them. Dry them out a bit and use them so they look lovely. But if not, of course, there's alder, which is so lovely because it has both the male and female catkins, but one looked like pine cones, and so it has catkins and pine cones on the branch at the same time. I love using larch, which is a deciduous fir, so it has the cones, but it doesn't have the leaves, and so you really see the cones standing out. I love using hazel, and because it's been relatively mild so far, the catkins are already starting to elongate here in Sussex, so that looks really pretty. So add those as the next layer, and that gives your wreath, it begins to give it some substance. And then into that, I will add greenery. And for greenery from here, from the garden, I've got one of many things I could use, and I'm going to list those, and these will be in the podcast notes. My favourite of all is rosemary, because we have tons of it here. We use it a lot in the kitchen, in the school here. But anyway, I think it's the most fantastic evergreen plant. Of course, fragrant, brilliant for pollinators. So I'm going to pick lots of rosemary. But we also have a whopping great bay tree, which, to be honest, is in need of a bit of a prune in its top. And so bay is another lovely, lovely thing that looks and smells fantastic. And you can pick from it if you want to for your Christmas lunch. For making, I love bay in my bread sauce. It makes delicious, just steeped in the milk with a clove of garlic and then adding in your breadcrumbs. It makes fantastic bread sauce. Magnolia grandiflora, we have one here. Quite a few people in cities tend to have those. They're really good. Another thing that people in cities tend to have that maybe will be happy with the prune right now is the lovely scented Trachospermum jasminoides. So that would be another thing that you could use. Viburnum tinus, or in the flower trade called laurustinus. Pittosporum, of course. Eucalyptus, of course. And you can either buy that or if you've got one in your garden. And perhaps an olive. Olive works really well. So loads and loads of things. Rosemary, bay, magnolias, the evergreen varieties, eucalyptus, pittosporum, viburnum, and olive. So those get added in to ideally just tucking into the moss, which is damp and will then keep them happy for ages. And what you want to do is to make those, you can either just add them in stem by stem, or what I tend to do is I make them into a little bunch. And I do that, and I'm just going to try and explain a really, really handy knot for you, which is that you get a length of twine and you double it. So you've got a very, very long U, if you see what I mean. So you've got a double length of twine, and you get the two cut ends and you tuck them through the loop, okay? So you're tucking the two cut ends through the loop, and then the double length of twine goes round the stems of the little bunch you're making. And then what you do is you pull either end of the cut ends in an opposite direction. So one of the cut ends goes right, one of the cut ends goes left, and it immediately becomes taut. And then you twizzle it round and tie it off. But it leaves nice long string arms, which then allow you to easily attach it to your wreath base. I hope that's clear. Anyway, it's called the hand-tied knot, and it is a really handy knot to learn. So we've got the wreath is all sort of constructed now. And so then you need to think about the colour and the oomph and the creative bits, I guess. I mean, it's all creative. But so for additions that give it the zing and the pizzazz, I tend to think of adding them either in threes, so in 3 blocks, and the 3 blocks sit at 12 o'clock on, if it's around, 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock. So if you're looking at a clock face, at the top, not quite at the bottom, but at 4 o'clock, not quite at the bottom, but to the left at 7 o'clock. Or you might want to do 5, and that's at 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. And as any of you will know with me, it doesn't have to be super precise. But what I'm saying is if you want 3 pizzazz bits in your wreath, or you want a more even scattering, almost so they merge into each other and you want 5, then you want 12, 4 or 7, or you want 12, 2, 5, 7 and 9. So again, I hope that's clear. Now, what are you going to add? Well, obviously, huge ribbon is a lovely thing, which tends to come at the end. Now, just decide from the get-go, is that going at the top, so at 12 o'clock, or is it going at the bottom, so at 6 o'clock? Because once you've decided that, you can position your other bits of pizzazz. And that should be as luxurious and huge as you can possibly, get to, I think. Almost it's like a ribbon on a wreath can't be too big. I mean, obviously it can if it drowns it, and I use a nice sort of silk velvet, and I'm using a kind of licheny, greeny, eau de Nili colour. But anyway, that's a lovely thing. But that is added right at the end, okay? But you need to decide its position before you get going with the other stuff. So what is the other stuff? Well, pine cones are obviously really lovely and incredibly sustainable. And you can go for a walk in the park and no one's going to mind if you pick up pine cones, take them home. They'll probably be sopping wet because of the terrible weather we've been having. Put them, your oven on the lowest setting and just literally just dry them out in the oven on the lowest setting. And on my fan oven, it takes an hour, but some other people, like if you've got an Agra or a range cooker, it might be 2 hours in the cooler oven. But you can just tell. And the great thing is when you dry out a pine cone, it opens up. So all the little, I don't know the proper name for them, but the scales open up. And that makes it much, much easier then to attach with string. So in the old days, I would have used wire here, but I don't. I use twine. And you just twizzle it in through the scales all the way round and tie it off. And then you can tie it into another one. Or again, leave long strands of the string so it can be easily attached onto the wreath base. So that's pine cones. If you want to do fruit, which again, we always used to do here, we used to do chains of cranberries when I was teaching. But also I love limes because, as you know, from the fruit bowl, they last incredibly well. I love using chilies. They last really well. And I also love the really tight-skinned clementines, and particularly if they've got the little leaves on, they're fantastic. Again, in the old days, I would have wired those on, but I don't now. I get a thick darning needle that has a really big eye so that I can thread the finest string through that, and that can then attach them one by one in the case of the citrus, but in a chain in the case of the cranberries. So that's your fruit. And with chilies, you can either do them singly or again in a chain. So they then get added on. And then, of course, you might want to do flowers. So one of the flowers, when I was walking around yesterday talking about this, the things that are still looking really good here, we've got chrysanthemums in the greenhouse, so I could use those. And we've got fantastic hellebores coming, both Helleborus niger, the Christmas rose, and the other one that I'm a massive fan of called Helleborus maestro, which flowers from November. And so I'm going to use some of those, but it will mean that I've got to use some plastic water vials, but that's fine because you fill them up with water. They've got a little top that you put on. It seals in the water. You can then feed that into your moss or twiggy base, and you can then tuck your flowers into that. And it does just make it that much more showy. And when you're taking the wreath apart to put on the compost heap, just store those to use next year or in a flower arrangement at another time of year. And then, of course, finally, you're adding your huge ribbon. And I would always say you're adding copper wire lights too. So some lovely lights onto the wreath base. Okay, so there we are. That is my first thing. But it's not my only thing because now we need to move on to the tree. So with the tree, there's great debate. And if you start looking around on the internet, you'll see there's a lot of stuff about this. So do you use a faux tree? So it's made from plastic and it is on the whole probably made in China, so shipped from the other side of the world. So those are the cons. But, of course, you can put it away and you can get it out next year. And so environmentally, it's actually pretty good. because you're not having to cut down a tree every year. And so lots of environmentally aware people that I know have a faux tree, and certainly Shane in his big venues where they have to have a whopper tree, which just feels too costly for the environment if it's for 3 or 4 weeks, they certainly use really, really classy faux trees. So that's a sort of decision for you. Just other options, remember. Sustainable plantations of Christmas trees absolutely exist. So you can find them, and however seriously you want to take this, you can. And you'll probably find one local to you that's really consciously sustainable and treating them like a crop. And it's just a slower crop to get to harvestable size, but it is a crop. And they do exist. And just remember to cut the end off if you're getting a real tree. So get a saw, cut the end off, and make sure they're in water, because that really does make a big difference to needle drop. What I'm going to do is number 3 and 4 for us. So we've got a potted tree from last year, and I bought it potted. And when I got back, I sort of put it out the back near the coal frames. And to be honest, I thought, well, I'm not sure I'm going to like this very much. But actually, I really do. It's quite elegant and graceful. It's a Nordman fir, and I like it. And we've actually got it out in what we call our dry yard, which is sort of round the back of our new greenhouse. And I'm going to pop that in the car, because I'm not actually spending Christmas at Perch Hill this year. I'm spending it in London. And I'll pop that in the car, and I'm going to take that. And that's quite small. So that's going to go for the hall or the kitchen. And then for where we're going to have our presents, I'm actually going to cut a branch of a silver birch. And the thing about silver birch is they're incredibly quick growers. So they're one of the most sustainable trees that you can chop down, so to speak. Or I'm going to try and find a branch even. So just take a section. And certainly when we're in Scotland, we always just go out into the woods with the children, no longer children, and pick a branch. So you just need to try and get it as balanced a shape as possible. So that's the stuff that I think one needs to be aware of on the tree. So what about decorating the tree? Well, I think it's worth, maybe let's start with the negative, and then we can move on very quickly to the positive, because I just don't want this to be negative. I guess I've already mentioned really probably stuff with glitter is a bit of a no-no. Not because, I love a bit of glitter. And there are developments being made of more quickly biodegradable glitter. But the thing is, one might think that it's on a card or a decoration, but unfortunately, as we all know, it drops off, and then it just gets into the system, whether it's your soil or whatever, and it's there forever. So they are little shards of microplastic. And anyway, we just have to be aware of that, don't we? And lametta, that stuff that you hang on the tree, the sort of silver rain, that's the same. So I'm going to go natural. I'm going to do loads of pomanders. Do you remember when we were children at school, we always used to make a pomander? So oranges and cloves. And I'm actually going to put my oven on the lower setting, and I'm going to do some split oranges too. So literally just put them in, cut the sides from down the sort of the longer angle. Oh man, I know an orange is round, but you know what I mean. And put them in, and they'll open up, and they won't cook, because that's not what you want. You just want them to dry out. But I'm also going to use tons and tons and tons of straw flowers. And we grew them specifically for this, really, for the winter as well as Christmas. So we had really quite a lot in the cutting garden this year. So straw flowers, heliochrysums, and they are fantastic and coming so much back into fashion, because do you know why? They keep their colour for 3 or 4 years, and you've got to keep them dry. So don't leave them in the potting shed or the garage, because they will rot, because it's the atmosphere around them is too humid. But if you can keep them dry, they really, really do keep their colour. And you can do so many different things with them. So I'm going to sit down and make lots more chains. And I made loads last year. So every year I'm building up more and more, and I just wrap them in tissue paper and put them in the attic with the decorations. And so I've got straw flower chains. I'm also making honesty chains, and I love those too. They're more fragile, but with a fine needle, you can make them into chains. So this is with needle and cotton, with both straw flower chains and honesty. And I am, of course, going to use tons and tons and tons of alliums. So I store these from 1 year to the next. The smallest that I use in plenty here is Purple Sensation. Next size up is the wonderful Christophii, and then the biggest to go on the top of the tree is Schubertii. And if you want them coloured rather than their natural sort of straw colour, there are various different things that you can do. If you want a very gentle wash of colour, then get food colouring and do it, just dilute it as little as you can afford, really, because obviously it's expensive if you have to get a lot. But I tend to do 50-50, and obviously red food colouring is easy to get hold of. And so I just put them in a bowl with the food colouring and the water, and I just rotate them round and round and round, put them to the side, let them dry out. If I want it a bit stronger, I do it again. But go also and look online for children's eco-friendly powder paint, and that works perfectly. So, classroom paint and make it into whatever strength you want, but that will give you a much more dense coverage. And if you want really dense, then a tip that Shane gave me is he uses Edward Bulmer paints, which are very ecologically friendly, and they use those with a paint atomizer. But that's if you're doing things in a bigger scale. And don't forget paper. So let's go back to making paper chains, getting our kids and grandchildren to make paper chains. And you can buy them, and then they concertina out for the next 3 weeks, and then they concertina back, go in the box, and off they go into the attic. So they're really great. I'm going to have tons and tons and tons. Most of our house is going to be decorated with different shapes, sizes, and colours of paper decorations, actually. And of course, lights. And so, the more copper wire lights you can have, the better, I would say. You just can't go wrong. So then the table. So this is obviously important, where you're going to have your feasts. And I tend to use a big vase in the middle. And I've got dried honesty that I've kept from before, but actually walking around the garden, I actually found some yesterday, some more. And you take the outer casing, both sides, off the honesty seed heads, and that's going to be my main pizzazz with lights. They go on next. And then I'm putting loads of the little alliums into that and mini decorations. So decorations about the size of £1 or maximum £2 coin. And the whole thing will be twinkly with lights and absolutely dense with colour from lots of mini decorations. But the base is entirely natural. From honesty, and maybe a few lichen branches from the garden. And the table's surface I'm going to cover with grasses that I dried from early in the year. I love Panicum violaceum and Panicum frosted explosion, which is the most wonderful grass, very easy to grow from seed. And I've actually dipped that in a bronzy coloured paint. I've got Brisa maxima, the greater quaking grass, but perhaps my favourite of all is the perennial grass, which has beautiful flowers called Chasmanthium latifolium. And again, that I've dipped. And actually, do you know, I've got loads of these grasses, again, wrapped in tissue paper, put in a box with the paper chains from last year. And so I build up all my natural decorations, and they don't disintegrate. They keep, particularly because you've covered them with paint or perhaps varnish. They last absolutely brilliantly. And 2 other mentions for good seed heads, or 3 actually, of course, hydrangea. Hydrangea is just brilliant. So I'm going to have pom-poms of hydrangea all the way down the middle of the table. I might have to remove those for the food when it comes to it, but hey, that's not very difficult. That's the work of 30 seconds. I love hydrangea petiolaris, the north-facing hydrangea with the most elegant sort of Japanese print-like seed heads. And if you don't have a hydrangea petiolaris, I bet you know a friend who does, and you could beg, steal or borrow 3 or 4 seed heads of that. And something we're using here a lot this year, we've got our Christmas staff party, and we filled the greenhouse with Nicandra, the shoe fly plant, picked whole plants in one go and then threaded with copper wire lights, leaves removed, and they look absolutely fabulous. Some we've dipped, some we've just left natural, and those look fantastic. And then, of course, loads and loads of candles, ideally beeswax or soy, a little bit better than paraffin, but, hey, you have to make that decision for you. And lots and lots and lots of ribbon and baubles scattered all the way down the table. Final thing, you might think, blimey, I'm exhausted, is I've got a chilli plant with red lights in the hall. So you walk in and it feels Christmassy and jolly, but those chilli plants have been giving us chilies all the way through the autumn, and now they're turning into Christmas decorations. They're in nice terracotta pots and they look great. And to avoid the 9 times round the globe of wrapping paper, maybe use fabric. And somebody posted a message after my Scribehound article saying that they wrapped all their presents in material, in fabric, and after Christmas Day they put them all back in a box, even the ribbon, put them up in the attic and got them out the following Christmas to wrap up again. And you can make your own choices and you can still personalise things, can't you? So there we are. So I hope tips for colour-filled, jolly, absolutely wonderful, fragrant candles, the whole lot, bowls and bowls of fruit, hyacinths, paper whites, didn't even mention force bulbs, but I've talked about them in previous years. So I really hope that we all have the most wonderful Christmas, and very, very happy Christmas to you all from me. And thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. And I hope it's been interesting, me chatting about what I'm going to be doing at Christmas, and in a way, sustainability being compatible with really beautiful, even blingy Christmas, if you use the right things. Next week, as we get very, very near Christmas Day and the whole kind of family festive time, I'm going to be joined by the crew who've written the most recent Ottolenghi book, Comfort. And so Tara and Verena, 2 of the authors, are going to join me and we're going to chat through utterly delicious Christmas food, but of the comforting kind. So join me next week. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.